I would now like to discuss in a bit more detail, elaborating on the second question that we also posed for the breakout rooms, principal possibilities that exist for assessing open science practices. And some of this will be a bit of a recapitulation of things that we already discussed, but I think it's good to sort of bring it back into our thinking. So first possibility, this is also something that Ted already mentioned, is to encourage pre-registration of research designs in some fields, at least. So the approach here is that you ask researchers essentially to make openly available a research design as part of a grant application, but it can also be in the context of simply scientific publishing. So research design that researchers commit themselves to, so they will follow the main research question and the methods that they have laid out in this pre-registered proposal. And that is meant to then prevent that they retrospectively change their research design, their questions, for example, to fit the data, which can be seen sometimes as a form of bad practice, like when you use data in a very selective way, you only showcase the nice bits of your data and you don't talk about the rest, and maybe you overemphasize the representativity of your findings. There's of course a risk here that this becomes a straitjacket for researchers, because some flexibility is of course always required in research. You always have to adapt in some ways your design to your findings, but it should not cross the threshold really of manipulative, selective kind of representation of your findings. And of course, some research fields are much more compatible with this idea of spelling out your research design beforehand than others. So generally, the more exact sciences will lend themselves much more to pre-registration of proposals or of publications than the interpretive fields. Yeah, another thing that you're already doing, of course, is open access publishing. So simply requiring researchers to publish in open access venues, and that can be open access journals, but also increasingly preprints. And a number of funders are really embracing and sort of promoting preprints as a form of open access publishing. So EMBO, for example, is encouraging refereed preprints for its EMBO postdoctoral fellowships, and NVO has also begun to encourage preprint publishing. Another thing is open peer review. Acknowledging really open peer review activity in an evaluative context that can be done through ORCID, which is a platform originally developed for author name disambiguation in the publishing context, but it has become a much richer resource in the meantime. So researchers use it to register all sorts of research activities. And you can also these days, register peer review activity, and you can also really indicate in quite some detail for which venues you have done your reviews, and you can also create links to open peer review reports. So that's also a possibility these days, and it's of course an open platform. And then this is also, of course, not news for you. Citizen science, societal engagement in research, public participation is commonly acknowledged in evaluative settings through all sorts of indicators. There's again a bit of a risk, as with all indicators, that this sort of becomes sort of a bean counting exercise. So, for example, simply quantifying how often, for example, a researcher appears in the media, which is not necessarily always a good measure of the quality of this kind of interaction, but it's a possibility. And then data management plans is also something that you already do. So data management plans are commonly required by funders as part of applications. And from in the last seminar, we learned that there are still differences between funders. So for NVO, this is kind of a part of the administrative bureaucratic requirement, as it were, of an application. It's not really part of the decision making itself, whereas in NVO it seems to, in RCN it seems to play bit more of a role also really in the evaluative decisions of reviewers. All right. And this is where I hand over to.
Yeah, so as a wrap up, let's take a look at some recent policy developments to put it all into the perspective before we start wrapping it up. So at European level, in the Horizon 2020 program, data sharing became increasingly important, with an open research data pilot being an intrinsic part of the whole program. In the Netherlands, both the strategy evaluation protocol and that reward and recognition initiatives are overarching developments trying to push open access and open science more systematically. So in the procedures to assess research, open science is now something that is a necessity to take into consideration. You cannot go without. The SEP framework provides great flexibility on how to actually do that. So it only gives you a kind of it's a protocol that is actually outlining the things to discuss, but it is not necessarily tick boxing exercise. So any unit under the SEP protocol can fill it in the way they would like to do that themselves, fitting their own research practices. And in Norway, the NORCAM model was the answer to the developments abroad. And as we've seen, it's a bit more like what's going on in the Netherlands, where a lot of autonomy is given to the universities to develop, for example, that R&R system themselves within their institutional context. My impression is, but that's of course a bit of an outsider's perspective, that the NORCAM framework in itself is more like, as Alexander called it, a toolbox that is actually giving you anything you need to do the assessment of research, and it can be on different levels. So let's finish with some considerations. Of course, an important thing to talk about is the alignment of policies, which are sometimes of a contradictory nature. If you think of, for example, the national policies and funders that aim at gold open access, Planes is an example of that. While universities, and in the Netherlands, we have, like I said, a lot of autonomy for universities, they're actually providing and supporting larger access to hybrid open access publishing. But also the reach of research grants and the requirements that are set out by funders within the institutional setting, is that always aligned? Are universities and research institutes asking for different things from their staff members? Is it always in line with what funders want? So that remains an issue for caretaking and discussion perhaps. And also keep in mind, and this is more from the evaluative perspective, that there are potential shortcomings in evaluation methods of open science. So thereby, and Wolfgang mentioned it, avoid the creation of new evaluative straitjackets. So try to be flexible in whatever you take into account when assessing research. So keep in mind that the new type of appearances in research, but preferably also in other academic activities, should not be quantified in the way we have quantified research in the past, by looking at, say, one-dimensional indicators that are not helpful in really understanding and valuing what's going on within academia. And another thing is that many current open access indicators do not really touch on the already existing structural exclusion situations. For example, diversity of publishing cultures, for example, books and edited volumes in the humanities, but also conference proceedings books in the engineering sciences. At the moment, the assessment procedures are not really fit to take that into account. Stronger, these type of scholarly communication forms are also not well taken care of in the transition towards more open forms of appearances.